The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, I rise to speak to this motion because all of us here, I think, would agree that access to information is a cornerstone of a healthy democracy. And the 28th of September 2023, that's tomorrow, is International Day for Universal Access to Information. When I looked into this, I went to the United Nations website on the International Day for Universal Access to Information, and it said this about the day. Informed citizens can make informed decisions, for instance, when going to the polls. Only when citizens know how they are governed can they hold their governments accountable for their decisions and actions. Information is power. Therefore, universal access to information is a cornerstone of healthy and inclusive knowledge societies. Universal access to information means that everyone has the right to seek, receive and impart information. This right is an integral part of the right to freedom of expression. The media plays a crucial role in informing the public about issues of interest, but it relies on the ability to seek and receive information too. Hence, the right to universal access to information is also bound up with the right to freedom of the press. Mr President, in the lead-up to International Day for Universal Access to Information, I regard it as highly relevant for us to take time to consider the importance of its statutory basis in this state, our Tasmanian Right to Information Act 2009. Right to information legislation, or freedom of information legislation as it was previously known here and is known in some other jurisdictions, is the foundation for citizens being able to exercise their right to access information from governments that represent them. When I looked to the second reading speech of our Tasmanian Right to Information Act 2009, I found it stated this: "The Right to Information Bill is legislation for today and for the future, dedicated to improving democratic government in Tasmania by increasing the accountability of the executive to the people of Tasmania, by increasing the ability of the people of Tasmania to participate in their own governance, and by acknowledging that information collected by public authorities is collected for and on behalf of the people of Tasmania." Mr President, however, despite those statements in the second reading speech from 2009, with claims to be legislating for the future, here we are in 2023 with concerns about our RTI system and its dysfunction across many years becoming louder and louder, and calls raised for reform. This culminated most recently in a report prepared by the Environmental Defenders Office and published in July this year, 2023, titled "Transparent Failure: Lutruwita Tasmania's Ineffective Right to Information System and How to Fix It." Mr President, I'd like to seek leave to table the report, if I may, as part of my contribution.
The honourable member for Nelson seeks leave to table a document. The question is leave granted? Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
Prompted by the release of this report, on the 11th of August 2023, a number of civil society groups wrote an open letter to the Premier calling for review and improvement of the Tasmanian RTI system. Those groups included Community Legal Centres Tasmania, the Environmental Defenders Office, the Human Rights Law Centre, Planning Matters Alliance Tasmania, the Australia Institute and the Tasmanian Council of Social Service. That open letter to the Premier pointed to the importance of a well-functioning RTI system, saying this: "The right to information, RTI, is enshrined in several international agreements, including Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. RTI is a critical component of Australia's system of government and helps to ensure that decision makers are accountable for their decisions. A well-functioning RTI system helps maintain trust in our political system." Mr President, the key phrase there is a well-functioning RTI system, I think. There is no one, I would say, in this state who would claim that what we have currently is a well-functioning RTI system. What we do have, though, is 30 years of history in terms of access to information legislation here in Tasmania. Our original Freedom of Information Act, 1991, was replaced by the Right to Information Act in 2009. The RTI Act was a result of review and reform of that previous FOI Act, with the firm intention of improvement to meet contemporary and future standards. In fact, again, looking to the second reading speech from 2009, there was an outline of the genesis of the 2009 Act. It said this: in August 2008, the Premier, David Bartlett, announced a 10-point plan to strengthen trust in democracy and political processes in Tasmania. That agenda included a review of the Freedom of Information Act 1991 with a view to improving transparency in the operations and decision-making processes of the government through better access to information for all Tasmanians. And further, it commented, Tasmania has taken a leading role in the current nationwide review of government information handling processes. So, Mr President, it was pleasing to see back then the second reading speech noting tripartisan engagement in the development of the bill, and a high degree of consensus was noted on the direction for the changes needed. The bill was explicitly based on the push model for proactive disclosure, in which disclosure of information must occur unless its disclosure would be contrary to the public interest. And the bill from 2009 clarified the test for determining this. With the passage of the Right to Information Act 2009, I imagine there was considerable optimism on a new era of transparency and accountability in Tasmania. A nation-leading role, broad political support, and a contemporary push model based on proactive disclosure should have set us up for a very positive new culture in relation to access to information in this state. However, Mr President, as we all know, when it comes to policy or a piece of legislation, success is all in the implementation and, in particular, the investment to underpin it. And on those fronts, it appears that the RTI Act has never reached its full potential and, in fact, has been a long-standing source of concern and complaint. The second reading speech, back then in 2009, also was somewhat prescient. It stated this: this bill hopes to change the prevailing view that this sort of legislation is a means to block the disclosure of information instead of a means to encourage and streamline disclosure with a framework of protection in limited circumstances. And in the time since its passing, Mr President, this aspiration, I think we can say, has never been effectively and fully achieved. The Environmental Defenders Report, referred to in this motion, released in July, describes two key complaints that have been made over time since the passage of the 2009 Act. It says those two complaints are this: one, when a request for information is made to a public authority or minister's office, it's common for the decision-maker to apply the Act in a way that prevents disclosure, often incorrectly. This leads to the perception of a growing culture of secrecy, where public authorities are actively preventing proper scrutiny of public administrative decision-making. And two, it takes an average nearly 3 years for an application for access to information to be finalised when it proceeds to an external review by the Tasmanian Ombudsman. In the event information is ultimately released, it may no longer be of any use. Both problems have received widespread media coverage and a commitment to improved transparency and accountability by government, yet this attention has not translated to a perceptible change in how RTI applications are processed by public authorities or the Tasmanian Ombudsman's office. So, Mr President, we've also seen frequent media articles in recent years noting the insufficiencies and failures in the performance of our nationally worst RTI system. To mention just a few of the many recent examples of just Mercury headlines to pick our local paper over the years, I noted one from May 21st, 2016, headlined "Push to Close Right to Information Loophole." From April 9th, 2018, "State lags the nation in right to information access and speed." December 4th, 2020, "Arm's length minister under fire for RTI meetings." August 23rd, 2022, "Secret state, Tasmania least likely to grant right to information requests." April 2nd, 2023, "Boom in right to information requests hits bureaucratic brick wall." Mr President, that's just a flavour of some of those. And in a Mercury article that I'd like to just quote from 14th of November 2022, we had yet another RTI-related headline, which was in the context of reporting on the annual report from the Ombudsman's Office for 2021-22. That article quoted from the annual report, and the quote that it used was this: "Of the 19 external review decisions completed by the 2021-22 reporting year, only 3 affirmed the decisions of the relevant public authority. The significant majority varied or set aside the decisions, and 2 of the decisions in which the public authority's decision was affirmed included significant criticism of the manner in which the assessed disclosure application had been handled. That 95% of the external reviews dealt with in the 2021-22 financial year identified issues with the manner in which the public authority had responded to a request for assessed disclosure is of concern. That's fairly much an understatement, I would have thought, Mr President. Criticism of 95% of the external reviews dealt with in that year. Went on to say the express object of the RTI Act is clear in relation to its pro-disclosure focus, seeking to increase government accountability and acknowledging that the public has a right to information held by public authorities who are acting on behalf of the people of Tasmania. Too often, sadly, adherence to this object is not evident in practice, and a closed and at times obstructive approach is taken when responding to requests for assessed disclosure which come before my office. So that was in the Mercury article quoting the report, the annual report from the Ombudsman. The article stated this in its comments, that the report noted that there are 100 further appeals awaiting review, roughly the same as the year before. The average wait time for a review is 587 days. Tasmania has been dubbed the nation's most secret state. Former Premier Gutwein promised reform in 2020 and revealed that 30% of RTI requests received no information at all, by far the worst performance in the nation. Mr President, the government has itself acknowledged deficiencies in the operation of the RTI Act in this state. In the 2022-23 state budget, additional funding was provided to the Ombudsman's office, which was described in the budget material in this way by the government. They said, and in recognition of the important role that right to information plays in promoting openness and transparency within government, the budget provides $500,000 over 2 years to improve and speed up RTI capability and practice in the state service. This will provide centralised training for skilled RTI practitioners, resulting in a smoother and more efficient process to action right to information requests. Such is the commitment, Mr President. But we know things have been awry for quite some time. We know that our nation-leading 2009 Act has not delivered on its intended outcome for strengthening our democracy through increased transparency and accountability. Those civil society groups who wrote to the Premier on the 11th of August this year noted as much. They said, in recent years there's been mounting perception that Tasmanian government agencies are increasingly obstructing public access to information. While the Tasmanian government has emphasised its commitment to governing with openness, fairness and transparency, concerning new data has been published that confirms there's an urgent need for action to fix the problems that are plaguing Tasmania's failing RTI system. The EDO report mentioned in this motion reviewed the handling of applications under the Right to Information Act by government departments, statutory authorities and the Tasmanian Ombudsman's Office. The report's findings highlighted serious deficiencies, Mr President, in the administration of the RTI laws over an extended period. From the executive summary of that report, I quote this: there is a mounting perception that Lutruwita Tasmanian government departments and authorities are increasingly willing to use exemptions under Lutruwita Tasmania's Right to Information Act 2009 to obstruct public access to information, particularly where that information may be damaging to either the government or industries that it regulates. And it further said this: our analysis confirms that Lutruwita Tasmania's Right to Information regime is foundering. Public authorities are failing to give effect to the objects of the RTI obligations by providing access to information. In fact, Lutruwita Tasmania has Australia's highest error rate in the interpretation of right to information legislation by public authorities and Australia's highest rate of refusal to grant access to information. EDO has also found that Tasmanians will also experience delays of nearly 3 years for external review of RTI decisions. That report and the analysis that was done within it drew on data from a range of sources, Mr President, including statistics from the Ombudsman's Office, published decisions by the Ombudsman in relation to external reviews, annual reports from the Ombudsman's Office and Department of Justice annual reports in relation to the administration of the RTI Act, and also documents produced by the Ombudsman in response to RTI applications from community legal centres and to questions put from the EDO. The report presents 10 key findings. They include things such as Tasmania having the lowest rate of RTI applications being granted in full, In 4 out of the 5 most recent reporting years, at least 70% of RTI decisions being overturned by the Tasmanian Ombudsman, either in full or in part, when external reviews were applied, demonstrating that public authorities are consistently misapplying the RTI Act to deny public access to information. It had a finding relating to the last year for which records were available, that being 21-22, that public authorities misapplied parts of the RTI Act in nearly every decision reviewed by the Ombudsman. The report has another finding around the average time taken to challenge decisions by a public authority denying access to information through seeking an external review. That has blown out from an average of, back in 2016-17, 230 days, through to, in 2021-22, 987 days. A further finding was that since 2012 there's been almost a linear increase in the number of RTI external review applications filed in each reporting period. However, there was no marked change in the number of external reviews conducted over the same period, which has caused that growing backlog of undecided external review applications. But despite that growing workload and backlog of RTI external review applications, the total revenue for the Ombudsman's Office has, when adjusted for inflation, remained relatively constant from 2012-13 through to 2021-22. Further in the findings of the report, it notes that while more staff within the Ombudsman's Office have recently been dedicated to external review of RTI decisions, the efficiency of processing the reviews has not increased by an equivalent rate. And I think that a further finding sheds more light on that, where it discovers that close to half the time it takes for the Ombudsman's Office to complete an external review of an RTI decision is attributable to the review being stalled in the draft or preliminary review stage, which suggests that there are more senior staff needed in the Ombudsman's Office to ensure that reviews can be completed in a timely manner and aren't stalled at that early work stage before getting ticked off, if you like, by the senior person to finalise the review. They also have a finding that there is a need for the RTI Act to be reviewed and amended to better facilitate public access to government information, and that further funding and resources will be required to ensure that obligations under the Act can be fulfilled. Mr. President, it's important to be quite clear when we're reflecting on those key findings from the report and before looking at the recommendations made for how to fix it. It's important to be clear and consider the consequences of a dysfunctional RTI system. And if we look at the RTI Act of 2009, it lays out very clear objects. And Object 1 from that Act clearly says this. 1, the object of this Act is to improve democratic government in Tasmania. A, by increasing the accountability of the executive to the people of Tasmania. And B, by increasing the ability of the people of Tasmania to participate in their governance. And C, by acknowledging that information collected by public authorities is collected for and on behalf of the people of Tasmania and is the property of the state. Mr. President, when the Act isn't being implemented as it should, the object of the Act is not being fulfilled, which means less accountability of the executive to the people of Tasmania and decreased ability of the people of Tasmania to participate in their governance. And that is what has prompted those civil society groups to note in their open letter to the Premier that the current lack of transparency in government decision-making and administration is threatening the health of democracy in this state. It's not a flippant statement, it's a factual statement. And no wonder they then go on to strongly urge the government to take actions outlined to fix the failing RTI system. I found it interesting in the EDO report to note the case studies that they presented, which showed experiences of both the EDO and its clients that demonstrated the consequences of a dysfunctional system. It gives us compelling insights into those consequences and the way in which we can see those functions, those objects of the Act not being fulfilled. For example, they describe citizens seeking to pursue legal action but losing the opportunity to do so when information sought from regulators was initially refused. And then, when the refusal was overturned on appeal, the appeal took 842 days, meaning the ability to pursue the legal avenues that they had wished had elapsed. They describe another situation of citizens seeking access to information in order to participate in a statutory public comment process, but being initially denied access to that information that was requested, only to have that overturned on review, but 1,104 days later. Far, far too late to facilitate informed comment in the statutory process, and therefore that citizen having their opportunity to participate fully in that process being denied. So, Mr. President, we have also seen the consequences of a dysfunctional RTI system highlighted in the Commission of Inquiry into Tasmanian Government's responses to child sexual abuse in institutional settings. In the report of the Commission of Inquiry, tabled just yesterday in Parliament, the Commission discuss the failings of the current RTI system in supporting victim survivors. In Volume 7 of the Inquiry's report, Chapter 6, Record Keeping and Access to Information, the report says this: to support a claim of civil liability or application for redress, victim survivors of institutional child sexual abuse often need access to information held by government. This information can also be critical, helping victim survivors understand the context in which the abuse occurred and the response at the time, if any. It may also provide a sense of recognition and acknowledgement of the abuse and harm it caused. For some victim survivors, access to this information can help fill gaps in their personal story. This role is particularly important for victim survivors who have been in state care. And further, Mr. President, it said this: individuals have a legislative right to access government information unless an exemption applies. Despite this right, in hearings, consultations and statements to our Commission of Inquiry, victim survivors and their representatives described systemic barriers to exercising this right, including costs, poor record keeping, lengthy delays, refusals and extensive redactions, with many resorting to slow and non-binding review processes. This evidence highlighted an administrative culture that was not pro-disclosure and which, combined with a complex legislative scheme and insufficient resourcing, limits the release of information in practice. So, Mr. President, there is no doubt that when it comes to the RTI system, we have a problem, and fixing it should be a matter of priority. The Tasmanian Government has publicly committed to openness, fairness and transparency. The Government will no doubt point to some limited efforts it is making to respond to the long-standing and repeated concerns raised over our dysfunctional RTI system. These include, as I mentioned earlier, the additional $500,000 in the Tasmanian budget over 2 years, which was intended to provide training for RTI officers within government agencies. I note that the Government has also put in place the Right to Information Uplift project, which has the stated aim to improve the way people get information held by the Tasmanian Government. This project, it appears, follows the Commission of Inquiry into Tasmanian Government's responses to child sexual abuse in institutional settings and the matters that were arising within the context of that Commission of Inquiry, where it was being identified that victim survivors were having a difficult time getting information held by government. My understanding is that Uplift project, begun in response to the Commission of Inquiry, is intending to improve the process for getting information, create the same training for RTI officers across government and look at ways to give more information. I do note when I go on the website that there was a survey which was open until the 1st of September 2023 for people who'd used the RTI system to complete and provide feedback. And I believe that some people were proactively contacted and invited to complete that survey, but I'm not aware that it was publicised widely. The survey is no longer accessible. It cannot be seen what the questions were or what information was sought. There's also on the website an email address which people are able to send an email to about their experiences with RTI. However, Mr. President, I find this fairly minimal and fairly invisible effort, and it's quite disappointing to note. Where is the more detailed information publicly available about the scope of this Uplift project, its timeframe, the key steps that will play out? Who is conducting the project? It appears to be done within DPAC rather than, say, an independent review. I wonder, Mr. President, will there be, say, a discussion paper produced and submissions or for feedback sought to feed through into perhaps a final report and recommendations on a way forward? Which external experts have been involved in informing this review? This is all unclear. They're just some of the questions that I have around this Uplift project, I feel it's been put in place as a bit of a knee-jerk response to what was arising out of the Commission of Inquiry. I hope that we can build on that and actually along the lines that the Commission is recommending and that the EDO in their report recommends, and as this motion calls on, we can do something more comprehensive and thorough. Mr. President, the EDO report certainly highlights that much more can and should be done by the Tasmanian Government to address the chronic delays and errors that are plaguing decisions in our RTI system. It calls on the Tasmanian Government to back its commitment to governing with openness, fairness and transparency by taking urgent action to fix our failing RTI system. The report makes 12 recommendations, the first of which are in a category that relate to reform of authorities' decision-making. Recommendations in that area: one is relating to the Act including express statement requiring routine and active release of information to be the preferred method of disclosure for government information. The second recommendation is to again amend the Act to introduce an explicit presumption that all information sought under the Act is disclosable to a member of the public. The presumption will only be rebutted where the public authority is satisfied that information falls into a category of exempt information under the Act, and where applicable that it would be contrary to public interest to disclose. Recommendation 3 is around an independent review of the existing exemptions from disclosure under the RTI Act to be undertaken, with a view to recommending amendments to clarify commonly misunderstood or misapplied provisions. Then there's a further category of recommendations that relate to reform of the external review process. Recommendation 4 says the RTI Act to be amended to provide a review period of 30 days to replace or qualify the current provisions that an external review be resolved as soon as reasonably practicable. I think we see the problem when it can push out beyond 1,000 days, Mr. President, that might not be enough of a constraint. Recommendation 5 suggests the Act be amended to remove the requirement that the Ombudsman provide a preliminary decision to public authorities and ministers where a decision is adverse to them and invite their input. Recommendation 6 talks about amending the Act to provide the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, TASCAT, with jurisdiction for external review of assessed disclosure decisions as an alternative and/or consecutive to a review by the Ombudsman. Then a further category of recommendations relate to capacity building and making improvements there. Recommendation 7, a comprehensive audit of the management and release of government information to be conducted, with a focus on incorporating technology-assisted compilation and review of information. Recommendation 8, that the Ombudsman's Office or another suitably qualified independent body be engaged to provide training to public authorities that focuses on the appropriate application of the RTI Act's exemptions and the public interest test. Recommendation 9, the Ombudsman to be required to publish all decisions on external review applications. Currently, only some are published. Recommendation 10, additional resources being deployed to the RTI jurisdiction of the Tasmanian Ombudsman's Office as a matter of urgency to arrest and reverse the growing backlog of external review applications. Recommendation 11 is around resourcing and staff distribution in the Ombudsman's Office, and particularly the RTI section, taking into account the demonstrated need for the Office to have sufficient officers at both junior drafting levels and senior settling and making levels, so we don't see things being stalled in the draft stage due to a lack of time and attention from a senior person. And the final recommendation, Mr. President, relates to a proposal for an independent review. That's recommendation 12, the RTI Act be amended to require regular independent reviews of its operation and implementation. In relation to that final recommendation 12, which aligns with the call made in the motion that we're considering here today, the EDO notes this in their report. While we expect the implementation of our recommendations would result in a great improvement to the RTI system, experience both in Tasmania and interstate demonstrates that amending the RTI Act may not be sufficient to resolve all the barriers in providing an effective system for accessing to information. Legislative change must be accompanied by strong leadership and rigorous, properly resourced compliance mechanisms to ensure the intent of legislation is fulfilled in its interpretation and implementation. To this end, we recommend that there be a requirement for regular, e.g. 3 to 5 yearly, independent reviews of both the operation and implementation of the RTI Act, with consideration given to the extent to which the objects of the Act are being achieved, the extent to which additional legislative measures, if any, are necessary to achieve the objects of the RTI Act within the periods required under the RTI Act, including by the introduction of performance standards or mandatory requirements, and whether public authorities in the Ombudsman's Office have been sufficiently resourced to fulfil their functions and obligations under the Act, and any other matter that the Ombudsman considers should be subject to review. The reviews and government's response to them should be tabled in Parliament. I note that call, Mr President, because that adds that further level of public visibility and accountability within this parliamentary context. Earlier, Mr President, I referred to the Commission of Inquiry report and the issues raised in that report relating to our RTI system. The Commission also made a recommendation on how to fix the system, which are well aligned with those that I've just mentioned from the EDO report. The relevant recommendation from the Commission of Inquiry report is recommendation 17.8. And it says this, that the Tasmanian Government should review and reform the operation of the Right to Information Act 2009 and the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 to ensure victim survivors of child sexual abuse in institutional context can obtain information relating to that abuse. This review should focus on what needs to change to ensure A, people's rights to obtain information are observed in practice, and B, this access is as simple, efficient, transparent and trauma-informed as possible. And it then goes on with the second part to that recommendation, Mr President. It says the review should consider reforms to the Right to Information Act 2009 and the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 to A, include an explicit presumption in favour of disclosure in the Right to Information Act and Personal Information Protection Act 2004. B, embed the public interest test in specific exemptions in the Right to Information Act 2009, tailored to those exemptions. C, streamline the interface between the Right to Information Act 2009 and the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 to overcome what has by default become a two-step process to obtain personal information. D, require that a personal information custodian under the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 must provide, rather than may provide, personal information upon request from an individual who's the subject of that information, subject to any appropriate exemptions to that requirement. E, include a reasonableness test in the Right to Information 2009, Right to Information Act 2009 as part of the assessment of whether to withhold personal information relating to a person or third party other than the person making the request for information. F, strengthen and streamline internal and external review processes in the Right to Information Act 2009 and Personal Information Protection Act 2004, with a focus on options to enforce decisions of the Ombudsman and to apply for review by the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. G, provide an automatic fee waiver for right to information applications relating to child sexual abuse made under the Right to Information Act 2009 by victim survivors or a person acting on their behalf. It has a third element to their recommendation, which is the Tasmanian Government should consider centralising management of access to information processes in a specialist unit or department, supported by access to information liaison officers located in government departments and agencies. And a fourth part of the recommendation is that the Tasmanian Government should provide funding to government departments, agencies and the Ombudsman, as the case may be, to A, ensure access to information requests are processed within statutory timeframes, B, speed up external review of right to information decisions, and C, provide trauma-informed training to the Tasmanian State Service in relation to victim survivor access to information. Mr President, there's a lot of alignment there. This is a resounding call now from various avenues, both civil society, from Tasmanian citizens themselves, from experts on this topic matter in our state, and now from our Commission of Inquiry that is whose report has just been tabled. So in conclusion, I think we would all appreciate, Mr President, that a commitment to improving accountability and transparency from around our governance is an investment in the health of our democracy. I believe that RTI Act of 2009 was spot on in its objectives, as I mentioned earlier, that increasing the accountability of the executive, increasing the ability of people of Tasmania being able to participate in their governance, and by acknowledging that information collected is for and on behalf of the people of Tasmania. They are all absolutely spot on, and we must give effect to them in actuality. It's important that we honestly acknowledge that since its passage in 2009, implementation of the RTI Act has fallen short in delivering on those objects of the Act. We've had this brought to our attention time and time and again over many years. However, our state does have this opportunity. We can actually make a tangible difference now, a positive progress, by undertaking a purposeful and thorough review. Such a review will provide guidance on how best to address things where they are falling short and changes or improvements that should be considered. It's certainly well past time to be considering tweaks or small adjustments or small new investments. This is time for comprehensive and thorough action. So I encourage members to support the call in this motion for such a review to be undertaken and for us to encourage the government that it will only be positive outcomes that come for our state, particularly vulnerable members of our state, as we've had highlighted through the Commission inquiry. And it's a responsibility of any government of the day to ensure that access to information is something that's available to all citizens.